I wasn't in a good place that fall, and saying it that plainly is still the cleanest way I know to tell the truth. My wife had been gone 11 months, and the farm looked like it knew. Half of it still ran because the animals don't care what your heart is doing, and half of it sagged in small, tired ways I kept pretending were temporary. The south gate dragged. 2 roof sheets on the equipment shed had lifted at one corner and clattered every time the wind came off the ridge. The north fence lay down in a long, crooked section where spring runoff had chewed the posts loose. I had a list for everything, and no real plan for any of it. My day started at 4:30 because it always had. Alarm on the old clock by the bed, feet on cold floor, coveralls from the chair, boots at the mudroom door where I'd left them with yesterday's dirt still drying on the soles. I'd start coffee not because I wanted coffee, but because it gave me 7 minutes to stand still and remember what came next. Calf pens first, heat lamps checked, waterline checked for ice at the valve, even if the forecast said 38 and clear. Then goats, then hens, then a second count on hens because coyotes had been bold all season, and bold coyotes turn numbers into subtraction if you let yourself get sloppy. By 6:30, I had feed dust in my nose and hay in my sleeves, and that faint ache at the base of my skull that had settled in as a permanent tenant. People think grief comes at you like weather, sudden and loud. Mine wasn't like that anymore. Mine had settled into routine. It lived in the spaces where a person used to be. The second coffee mug that stayed upside down in the drainer because I couldn't decide where else to put it. The grocery list still folded in my wallet with Ellen's handwriting on one side, soap, onions, battery for barn clock, and my own on the other side, fence staples, iodine, diesel additive. I carried that list until the paper went soft at the folds. I ate supper standing at the sink because sitting at the table felt like setting an extra place for a ghost and then pretending not to notice. I told myself I was doing what needed doing. That was the line I used with folks in town, and on good days, I nearly believed it. I paid feed bills on time. I rotated pasture as best I could with the broken section up north. I kept records in a neat ledger, weights and dates and medicine lot numbers, the kind of details practical men lean on when life goes crooked. I listened to weather radio in the truck and kept 3 days ahead in my head. Frost line, wind shift, chance of wet snow. If I stayed inside that framework, I could make it to dark. If I made it to dark, I could sleep in my coveralls on the couch by the mudroom and wake for the next round. It wasn't living much. It was holding a line. Caleb called twice in September, once in October. I watched the phone light up on the counter and let it go dark each time. My son had his own life 2 counties over, a job in town, a little rented house with a porch and flower pots his mother would have approved of. He and I had managed to turn one bad argument into 3 years of careful distance before Ellen got sick. And after the funeral, we somehow made it worse by trying to be polite. He wanted to help, and I heard pity. I wanted to explain myself, and all I had was silence. That is a hard thing to admit out loud. Shame can dress itself up as self-reliance, real easy on a farm. One Thursday at the co-op, Marty Jenkins leaned on a pallet of mineral tubs and squinted at me over his glasses. "You look wore thin, Roy. You need a hand on that north line. I can come by Sunday." "I got it," I said too fast. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. "All right, offer stands." On the way out, he added, "Caleb was in last week, asked after you." I adjusted the sack on my shoulder and stared at the concrete by my boot. "He's doing okay?" "Seems so." Asked if your healer still chases his truck tires. That got a breath of a laugh out of me in spite of myself. "Junie's older now. She just judges people." Marty grinned once. "That dog always had better sense than both of you." Then he let me leave without pressing it, which was kinder than anything else he could have done. Junie was 13 and blue-speckled, and missing one tooth on the left side. Her hips were stiff in the mornings, but she still did a full patrol before breakfast, nose low, ears up, like the place was her personal assignment from a higher office. She slept on a folded horse blanket by the wood stove and followed me from pen to pen with that steady, workmanlike focus good dogs have. When I talked out loud, it was mostly to her. Water troughs low, old girl. Don't let that red hen fool you. She'll peck your nose. We're one busted hinge away from complete chaos. She listened with patient eyes and no opinions, which made her better company than most folks I knew. Late autumn settled in slow. Not pretty at first, just practical. Mud that held your boot a half-second too long. Maple leaves plastered flat to ruts in the lane. Breath showing white at dawn and gone by 10. Then one evening the sky cleared after a day of low cloud, and the whole west pasture turned the colour of old copper. I stood at the back gate with my hand on the latch and looked over ground I'd walked for 27 years. And for the first time in months, I felt the exact weight of being one person on too much land. No drama to it, just a plain fact. One person, too much land, and no good reason to keep pretending that grief had an expiration date, like milk. After supper, I started taking longer dusk walks to the far pasture. At first, I figured I was checking fence tension and looking for fresh dig marks where coyotes had tried under. That was true, but it wasn't the full truth. The full truth was that if I kept moving, I didn't have to stand in the kitchen and decide whether to call Caleb. I carried my old flashlight, the heavy metal one with dents in the barrel, and took the path by the creek where the willow roots knuckled up through the dirt. Junie padded ahead and doubled back, and then ranged out again, always circling, always checking where I was. Those walks became the part of the day I dreaded and needed at the same time. The ridgeline at dusk had a way of stripping things down. You hear what's there and what isn't. The creek talking low over stones, crows arguing themselves into roosts, dry grass ticking against denim when wind came across it, and then, after full dark, the coyotes. Sometimes one yip from high ground, then another, then a whole ragged chain of them taking turns with the valley like they were passing a message. I'd stand with one hand on a fence post and listen until my jaw hurt from clenching. Predators do what predators do. I knew that. Didn't make it easier when the thing they wanted was mine. On a Tuesday near the end of October, I reached the back pasture later than usual. Mist had started rising off the low ground, and the pines on the far edge looked taller than they did in daylight, like the dark had stretched them. Junie stopped 15 yards ahead of me at the tree line and stood very still. Tail low, not tucked, ears forward. Then she looked back at me, wagged once, and turned her head toward the pines again. Not alarmed, not playful. Attentive, like she was waiting for permission from someone I couldn't see. "Go on then," I said softly, because I didn't know what else to say. She took 3 steps, then sat down. Just sat. Nose lifted, breathing the air. I waited for a deer to break cover, or a raccoon, or one of the neighbors' wandering calves. Nothing moved. The light drained another shade. My chest did that tight thing it had done for months, and I hated it for showing up again. I remember thinking, plain as if I'd said it aloud, I am so tired of carrying this alone. The words sat there with me in the mist, no answer coming back. I turned for home when it got too dim to trust my footing by the creek bank. Junie followed, then paused twice to glance over her shoulder at the same stand of pines. At the barn, I topped off water buckets, checked Daisy's flank where she'd rubbed against a post, and latched the coop. My hands knew every latch by feel. My mind was already in that kitchen, looking at a dark phone. By the time I stepped onto the porch, the first coyote call should have come from the ridge. It didn't. I stood there longer than made sense, waiting for the sound that had become part of the farm's nightly math. Wind in the cottonwoods, loose tin tapping once on the shed roof. Junie settled by my boot and stared toward the back field, calm as Sunday. No yipping, no answering calls, just a wide, held quiet that felt less empty than usual, as if the edges of the place were being watched by something patient. I chalked it up to weather, scent shift. Maybe the pack moved east for easier hunting. Good practical reasons. I had plenty of them. I went inside, set a can of soup on the stove, and ate standing at the sink while Junie slept by the door. Near midnight, I woke on the couch, blanket twisted at my knees, and listened hard. Still nothing from the ridge. I almost laughed at myself then, there in the dark, a grown man in work boots trying to decode silence like it was a weather bulletin. "Get a grip, Fisher," I muttered. "You're negotiating with quiet now." It was ridiculous enough that I did laugh. One short, rusty sound. The first one that hadn't felt forced in a long while. Then I checked the mudroom lock, checked it again, and lay back down with my hand resting on Junie's shoulder, both of us listening to the farm breathe. I stayed there a long minute with my palm on Junie's ribs, feeling her slow breathing under the heel of my hand, waiting for the ridge to make its usual night noise and prove I hadn't suddenly forgotten how this place worked. It never came. The quiet held. Not dead quiet, not that odd pressure folks talk about when weather's about to break. Just the ordinary sounds spread wider than usual, like the land had room in it again. The refrigerator kicked on in the kitchen. A branch tapped once against the siding and stopped. Somewhere out by the creek, a barred owl gave one short call and then settled. Junie sighed, stretched her back legs, and went right back to sleep. I lay there in my coveralls with my eyes open in the dark and told myself, plain and practical, pack moved on, that's all. I said it a few times in my head until the words quit meaning anything, and sometime toward morning I drifted off with my boots still on. The alarm on the bedside clock in the other room buzzed at 4:30, and I went through my routine with that foggy, half-awake heaviness that makes each task feel a little farther away than your hands. Coffee, mudroom light, feed buckets. Junie shook herself on the mat and followed me out. Frost had silvered the top wire on the lane fence, and each step across the yard made that dry crunch you only get in late fall when the ground hardens overnight and gives back by noon. I checked the calf pen first, then the goat shed, expecting the usual jumpy stamping from the does at the back wall, if coyotes had circled close in the night. Nothing. They looked up, chewed, and went back to chewing. I stood there with my hand on the gate and watched for a moment, because calm goats at dawn are a small miracle, even on a good week. One of the younger does wandered over and nosed my sleeve like she wanted a snack, and I remember thinking she hadn't done that since midsummer. Out by the hen run, the birds came off the roost in a slow, fussy stream and spread themselves along the fence line, scratching through leaves as if they owned the place. No panicked fluttering, no missing feathers, no fresh dig marks under the wire where I'd doubled the mesh last month. I counted once, then counted again out of habit. Same number both times. At the far side of the yard, Junie wasn't helping. She was facing the back pasture and standing still as a carved dog on a courthouse lawn, tail low and moving easy side to side. Not stiff, not on alert, just attentive, watching that same band of pines at the edge of my north field. I called her name. She flicked one ear at me and kept looking. "Morning patrol got promoted, did it?" I said. She glanced over, gave me that old, patient expression that had kept me honest for 13 years, and then returned to her post like she had serious business that did not include me. I would have laughed harder if it hadn't put that odd sensation back in my chest. Not fear, more like standing in a room where someone had just stepped out and left warmth behind. By first light, I took the ATV along the North Line, mostly to prove to myself this was a track and scent problem, and not some storybook nonsense I was too old to entertain. The washout section looked the same as yesterday. 3 posts down and one leaning woven wire twisted where spring current had pushed debris through and peeled it open. Mud held tracks good after a damp night, and there were coyote prints there all right, 3, maybe 4 animals, light and clean-edged. They'd run the line like always. Then, 20 yards short of the busted section, every set angled toward the tree line and turned back up the slope. Not scattered, not spooked, just turned neat as if called off by a whistle I couldn't hear. I cut the engine and crouched, squinting at the ground like maybe closer would make it ordinary. My own boot marks from yesterday were there. Deer tracks crossed them, rabbit tracks stitched between. The coyote's trail came down in a braid, hit that one patch of ground, and reversed. I stood up slow, hands on my knees, and said out loud, "Well, that's new." No answer but the creek and a couple crows. At the co-op later that morning, I ran into Marty by the seed display. He was loading mineral blocks into the back of his truck, cap pushed up, reading the weather station printout taped to the wall. I held up a sack of layer pellets and tried to sound casual. "You hearing much coyote noise your way this week?" He looked over. "Funny you ask. Been quiet over by our hay meadow too. Figured they pushed west after rabbits." "Maybe." He studied me for a second, then jerked his chin toward the coffee urn. "You look like you slept in a ditch." "Couch," I said. "Upgrades are coming." That got a snort out of him. We poured bad co-op coffee into paper cups and stood by the bolt bins while 2 guys argued over fencing staples down the aisle. Marty said, "You ever get that North Line back up?" "Not yet. I keep planning it, and then doing 10 other things. Still can come by Sunday." I shook my head by reflex, then caught myself and made it softer. "Appreciate it. Might take you up once I sort posts." He nodded, and after a beat he said, "Caleb's not the enemy, Roy." I looked down into my cup. Didn't say he was. "You don't have to. I've known you both too long." He took a sip, grimaced at the coffee, and added, "Call him when you're less tired than mad. Works better." I gave a tight smile and headed for the register with feed and fence clips, which was my favorite method for ending conversations I didn't want and needed anyway. The second night stayed quiet too. I walked the dusk route with my flashlight and found myself listening harder to what wasn't there than what was. The creek ran low and clear over stones that clicked against each other when the current shifted. Wind moved through dry cottonwood leaves with that paper sound, brittle and soft together. A doe and last spring's fawn stood in the lower field, heads down, feeding in open ground long past the time they usually tucked into cover. Junie trotted 20 feet ahead of me, paused at the tree line, and sat. Same place as before, same low wag. I stood beside her with the flashlight hanging at my side and felt ridiculous for half expecting somebody to step out and nod. Hello. Nobody did. Still, I said, "Evenin'," under my breath like a fool greeting dark trees. Back at the house, I ate canned stew at the sink and stared at my phone on the counter until the screen timed out. I told myself, call Caleb tomorrow, then revised it to this weekend, then shut the kitchen light and carried my blanket to the couch without deciding anything. Around midnight, I woke again to silence. No yips, no answering calls. I'd spent most of October bracing for that sound and cursing it when it came. Without it, the night felt wide and unfamiliar, and I couldn't decide whether that was a gift or a warning. On the third morning, I found the cedar posts. I had gone out to the North Line with a thermos and a pry bar, planning to at least pull old staples and clear brush before breakfast. Dawn was thin and grey, mist hanging low in the swale by the creek, and my breath moved in front of me like smoke from a slow fire. I came around the bend in the fence and stopped so hard I sloshed coffee onto my glove. Beside the downed section, stacked just off the mud in a straight, careful row, were split cedar posts. Not junky leftovers, not random stormfall hacked apart. Good posts. Clean, dry faces. Bark-trimmed, pointed ends all turned the same direction, sorted by length in 3 neat groups, like somebody with patience had laid out a shop bench. There were enough to rebuild the whole washed-out run and brace both corners. I knew every inch of that stretch. Those posts had not been there yesterday. I stood there with the thermos in one hand and the pry bar in the other, and looked up and down the line for tire ruts, boot prints, any sign of who'd hauled them in. There were tracks, but the ground had started to crust and then soften again with mist, blurring edges into smudges that told me nothing clear. No trailer marks, no fresh chainsaw chips, just those posts, waiting. The way they were sorted hit me first, sharper than it should have. Ellen used to do lumber like that whenever we fixed anything bigger than a gate latch. "Longest on the left, so you quit hunting mid-job," she'd say, tapping my shoulder with a pencil. "Short braces in their own pile, or you'll cuss and blame physics." She'd grin when she said it, and I'd pretend to argue while she proved herself right. I set the thermos on a stump and rubbed my hand over one cedar face, smooth and dry. The smell lifted right away, clean and sharp, and for a second I had that old muscle memory of her passing me tools before I asked. It took the breath out of me. I bent, put my hands on my knees, and waited for it to pass. "Neighbor," I said to the trees. Has to be. Maybe Marty dropped them off early, I thought. Maybe Caleb came by while I was out and didn't want to talk. Maybe somebody traded work for work and planned to mention it later. I ran through each explanation like checking fuses, one by one. All possible, none fitting clean. Junie came up from behind me, sniffed the end of a post, then turned toward the pines and sat again, tail thumping once against the frost-burned grass. She wasn't wary. She looked pleased, if a dog can look pleased about lumber organization. I heard myself whisper, "Thank you." And that was the part that finally tipped me into a laugh. Not a big one, just a rough little burst that fogged in the cold air. Because there I was, Roy Fisher, 58 years old, thanking empty woods for carpentry help before sunrise. If anybody from town had seen me, they'd have scheduled me for a checkup and maybe a sermon. "Don't start," I told myself. "Posts are posts. Put 'em in the ground." I worked that line till my shoulders burned, dug new holes where runoff had blown out the old ones, set the longest cedar first, tamped earth with the back of the bar, stretched wire, clipped and reclipped where tension pulled uneven. Junie ranged back and forth between me and the tree line in a lazy loop, never straying far. Around noon she barked once, not sharp, just a heads-up bark she used when the mail truck came and trotted to the edge of the field. I straightened and looked over. Nothing I could see. She stood there wagging that low, easy wag, and then came back to lie in the sun patch by my toolbox. By the time I finished, my gloves were soaked and my lower back was reminding me I was not 25. I stepped back to inspect the repair and felt an old, stubborn satisfaction I hadn't felt in months. Lines straight, braces tight, gate swing clear. Practical progress. Something fixed. I gathered tools and turned for the house, then stopped and looked once more toward the pines. "Whoever you are," I said, quiet enough it barely carried. That was decent. The trees held still. A pair of chickadees flicked through the lower branches and scolded me for existing. Junie leaned against my leg for a moment, warm and solid, then headed down the lane like she expected me to keep up. Curiosity is a funny thing when you've been living inside grief. It doesn't arrive as joy, it arrives as interruption. The next morning, instead of replaying old arguments with Caleb while I filled water troughs, I found myself scanning mud edges and gateposts for signs I'd missed. I checked the North Line twice. I took a longer route to the creek ford where calves like to wander in spring. At the crossing, 2 smooth stones sat on top of a flat rock, crossed like an X, and balanced so carefully I doubted wind had anything to do with it. I nudged one with my boot. It rocked and settled back into place. "Kids," I said, "or raccoons with artistic ambitions?" I didn't believe either answer, and I knew it. That afternoon, I went through old habits and new questions at the same time. I mended a hinge on the goat shed. I cleaned the ash pan on the wood stove. I called the feed rep about a delayed mineral order and wrote the date in my ledger. Between each task, I caught myself looking toward the back pasture. The light had that late November slant to it, low and gold at 4 o'clock, stretching shadows thin across the field. Junie spent most of the day drifting between wherever I was working and that same pine edge, never tense, just watchful. Once, while I was hauling 2 buckets to the trough, she stopped in the lane and gave one soft chuff toward the trees, then looked back at me with her ears tilted like she expected me to acknowledge someone. "All right," I said to her. "I see where you're looking." That evening, I made myself sit at the table instead of the sink. First time in a long while. I set 1 plate, 1 fork, 1 glass of water, and ate reheated beans while the house popped and settled around me. Halfway through, I reached for the phone before I could overthink it and dialed Caleb. It rang 4 times. Voicemail picked up. I hung up without leaving a message, heart knocking harder than it should have over a call to my own son. I sat there with my hand on the phone and stared out the dark kitchen window. "Tried," I said out loud, though nobody was grading effort. Junie lifted her head from the rug and gave me a look that said she'd seen better attempts from me and wasn't impressed. "Fair," I told her. "I'll do it proper." After chores the next dawn, I found another sign, smaller than the posts and somehow harder to shrug off. By the water trough near the old cottonwood, somebody had laid 3 wild asters in a neat fan against the base. Stems aligned, blooms still fresh with dew, purple petals, yellow centers, clean and bright against rusted metal. Asters were still clinging on in sheltered spots by the creek bank, but not right there. Not in that pattern. My first thought was that a neighbor kid was playing a prank with florist instincts. My second thought was, Ellen used to tuck roadside flowers into any bucket, jar, or coffee cup she could reach, and call it improving the mood of machinery. I stood there holding an empty feed scoop and felt my throat tighten. Not like the sharp wave right after she died. This was quieter, deeper, a kind of ache with room around it. I crouched and touched one stem. Cool, damp, real. I remember thinking, clear as spoken words, this couldn't be real in the way I understood real. Then another thought followed right behind it. Real enough is what's in front of you. I sat back on my heels and watched my breath drift over those flowers while Junie waited beside me, calm as church. I did what practical men do when facts don't line up. I started a list. In the feed ledger, after mineral order and vaccine notes, I added a new page and wrote, "Night quiet, 3 days. Coyote tracks turn at north tree line, cedar posts stacked and sorted, stones crossed at creek ford, asters by trough." I underlined each item once, hard enough the pen tore paper at the edge. Around noon, Marty called to ask if I still needed help with the fence. I told him I'd gotten it patched. "You?" he said. "By yourself?" "Mostly," I said, then paused too long. "Mostly?" he repeated. I leaned on the porch rail and watched Junie in the yard, nose to the wind, tail moving. Somebody dropped cedar posts, didn't say who. Marty let out a low whistle. Well, that was neighborly. Folks still do that if they see a man underwater. Yeah. You ask around? Not yet. He was quiet a beat. Ask if you want, or just take the help and pass it on later. That's kind of where I landed. He shifted topics to feed prices and weather, and we ended the call easy. After I hung up, I sat on the top step and listened. Wind through grass, a pickup far off on County Road. No coyotes. Junie came over and rested her chin on my knee. I scratched behind her ears and felt, for a moment, not happy exactly, but present. Not trapped in yesterday or dreading tomorrow. Just there on my own porch with a dog and the smell of cedar still on my gloves. At dusk, I walked to the back pasture again, slower than usual, flashlight unlit in my hand. The sky had gone lavender over the ridge, and mist was starting to gather in the low spots by the creek. Halfway to the pine edge, a mule deer stepped out from behind the old hay wagon and began to graze. It looked up at me once, judged me harmless, and kept eating. Junie sat beside me without being told, and looked into the trees with that same patient attention. I looked too, and this time I didn't force an explanation right away. I just stood there and let the quiet settle around us, steady and wide, and said softly into the evening, I notice. The words barely left my mouth when Junie's ears tipped forward like she'd caught a footstep I hadn't, and the mule deer raised its head from the grass without bolting, chewing slow, looking past me toward the cottonwoods along the creek. I heard it then, not a crash, not brush breaking, just the soft push of weight through wet leaves, measured and careful, the way you move through somebody else's workshop when you don't want to knock tools off a bench. Mist had thickened low across the pasture, and the last light sat in it, turning every fence wire pale. Between two trunks a shape crossed, dark against dark, and my mind did that hard practical jump for familiar categories. Horse, no. Bull, no. Bear. Maybe for half a second until it stepped around a sapling with a kind of deliberate patience I had never seen in any bear that ever wandered this county. It was tall enough that when it came near the old clothesline posts by the shed path, it dipped its shoulders to pass under the drooping line instead of brushing through it. I stood there with my flashlight hanging dead at my side and mud drying on my boots, and thought, real clear. I actually said excuse me to a feed auger once, so maybe saying hello to a shadow wasn't the strangest thing I'd done this year. My mouth worked before my pride caught up. Evening, I said, quiet as if I were speaking in church. It stopped, not startled, just stopped, and turned enough that I could make out breadth across the shoulders and the slope of a head above them, fur dark as soaked bark, rain beading and rolling off. Junie took 3 easy steps forward, tail low and swinging, then sat down like she'd arrived exactly where she meant to be. I wanted to call her back. I didn't. I told myself this couldn't be real, that I was overtired and half-haunted and making forms out of fog. At the same time, another part of me was taking inventory, like always. Deer still in place at 20 yards. No alarm stomp. Wind carrying from me to it. No charge posture. No forward lean. No sign of cornering. It shifted 1 foot, slow enough I could follow the movement, and stepped aside from the narrow game trail like it was giving right of way. Then it looked at me, and even through the mist I caught the eyes. Amber brown, level, steady, not flat and bright. Like panic, not hard, like challenge. I wanted to run, but something made me stay. My hands shook anyway. It held that look 1 breath longer, then turned and moved back toward the pines, each step placed clean, leaving grass bent but not thrashed, and the trees took it in until there was only mist, and the creek talking over stones again. I walked home in a straight line because it felt important to keep doing ordinary things in ordinary order. I checked the goat latch. I counted hens. I put out grain for the barn cats, who wound around my ankles and complained like I'd personally invented lateness. Nothing in the yard had the frantic edge I'd gotten used to on coyote nights. Even Daisy, broad with calf and usually touchy around dusk, took hay from my hand and went back to chewing with that deep, patient jaw work cattle have when the world is acceptable. In the kitchen, I set leftover beans on the stove and forgot to light the burner for a full minute, standing there with a match in my fingers while my brain replayed the shape passing under the clothesline. I tried the usual explanations again. Big man in a ghillie coat, neighbour in bad light, trick of distance. Each one fell apart on size, on movement, on the plain fact that Junie had met it with the same calm she gave Marty's truck. Near 9, I called Marty anyway. He picked up on the second ring. "You break something expensive." "Not yet," I said. "You out by my north pasture tonight?" "Nope." "Why?" I stared at the dark window over the sink. "Thought I saw someone by the cottonwoods. Tall fella. Might have cut across." He let that sit a beat. "How tall?" "Tall enough I feel dumb saying it." A soft exhale came through the line. "Roy, you want me to come over?" "No, I just wanted to rule out known people." "All right," he said, voice gentler than usual. "Known people ruled out. You lock up? Get some sleep?" "Yeah." "And Roy?" "Yeah." "Call Caleb tomorrow. Don't wait for a perfect mind. None of us got one." After we hung up, I did lock up, checked the mudroom door twice, and lay on the couch with Junie pressed along my shins. Sometime after midnight, I woke to stillness again. No ridge chorus, no nervous thumping from the goat shed, just wind easing around the corners of the house, and that long quiet that had started to feel less like an absence and more like watch, kept by someone who didn't need thanks. At first light, I went straight to the cottonwoods with a tape measure in my coat pocket, like a man collecting evidence for his own sanity. Ground there stayed damp longer than the open pasture, and tracks held if you knew where to look. I found deer slots, raccoon prints, my own boot marks from last evening, then something else along the margin where mud met leaf litter. A deep, broad impression with distinct toe marks and a long heel, longer than my forearm from wrist to elbow. I set my boot beside it and laughed once under my breath, not from humour exactly, more from that strange pressure relief when facts finally stop pretending to be ordinary. Junie sniffed the print, sneezed and sat down, looking toward the trees with mild expectation. I measured without thinking and wrote the number on my palm with a carpenter pencil. Then I stood there and argued with myself in present tense because grief had taught me to narrate survival one sentence at a time. I am not a man who goes looking for legends. I am a man with feed invoices and fence clips in his truck console. I know what bears track like, what elk track like, what a prank looks like, what soft ground does to shape. I knew, somehow, that I wasn't in danger, and that knowledge sat in me as plain as cold. I spent most of that day working close to the house, half because chores needed doing, and half because I wanted to see if the feeling would fade once sunlight flattened everything back to normal size. It didn't. Around 4, with clouds stacking from the west and a thin rain starting, I carried a thermos to the old wagon in back pasture and sat on an overturned bucket where I could watch the pine edge without looking like I was watching. Junie lay at my feet, chin on paws, eyes open. A mule deer came out early, then another. 2 barn cats trailed me farther than they usually did and perched on the fence rail, tails wrapped over their paws like old men at a barber shop. Rain pattered on the wagon boards. Dusk drew long and blue between trunks. Then the pines parted, and he stepped out full enough to remove doubt. He was massive, near as high as my tractor cab at the shoulder, when he passed a low branch, fur dark with lighter guard hairs catching rain, arms long and powerful but moving with care that kept every gesture quiet. He stopped 40 feet off and turned sideways, giving distance. Junie stood, wagged once, and sat again. The deer lowered their heads and kept grazing. I could hear my own breathing. So could he. "Don't know your rules," I said, voice rough. "But I'm Roy." He didn't move toward me. He didn't move away. He angled his head, watching those amber-brown eyes steady as creek stones. I felt tears prick and got irritated with myself for it, because I had spent nearly a year turning grief into tasks. And here I was, crying in drizzle at a stranger too large for reason. Yet there was no shame in the moment, just a deep recognition I couldn't frame. He reached down with one huge hand and lifted a wind-fallen branch off the game trail, set it aside so cleanly the leaves barely shivered, then took 2 backward steps, as if to show he understood boundaries better than most people did. We stayed like that another minute, maybe 2. I tipped my hat because manners outlast certainty where I come from. "All right," I said. "I see you." He gave the smallest nod-like dip, turned and went back into the trees, unhurried, leaving the rain to close behind him. The hard weather came 3 nights later, mean and sudden. A north wind shoved through after dark with needle-fine sleet that rattled on the shed roof and turned the yard light into a white blur. I had just stretched out on the couch when Junie lifted her head and gave one low, intent woof. Not alarmed, just urgent. From up near the lambing pen came that tight bunch and shift from sheep, the sound of a flock trying to make itself smaller. I grabbed my coat, flashlight, and the old stock stick by the mudroom and stepped into the cold with Junie at my knee. By the time I cleared the porch, I caught eyes along the far fence. 3 sets at least, green-white in the beam, low and patient. Split ear was there too, scar through one ear plain even at distance, standing broadside and measuring gaps like he always did when he thought he had time. I started forward, boots slipping on crusted mud, and something answered from the pine edge behind the pen. One deep wood-on-wood crack like a post, knocked against a trunk. Then a second, slower. Not random storm noise, deliberate spacing. The coyotes froze and turned their heads toward the trees as one. I swung my light that direction and caught motion high at the margin where pasture gave way to dark timber. Just a shoulder line and the suggestion of height between blowing branches, too far and too broken by sleet for anything more. It never crossed the fence. It never came into the yard. It stayed at the perimeter like a sentry keeping to his own side of a property line. Split Ear took one testing step, then stopped short as if he'd hit an invisible wire. The sheep, instead of panicking, settled into a tight cluster away from the weak corner where spring wash had thinned the brush. Junie stood steady, tail level, ears forward, no growl. Wind drove sleet across my face, and I kept the light moving between eyeshine and tree line while the yard held in that strained pause where everybody waits to see who commits first. Nobody did. One coyote broke, then another. Split Ear lingered longest, chest angled toward the opening, then swung uphill and followed the pack into dark. By the time I flashed back to the timber margin, whatever had been standing there was gone, swallowed by weather and pine trunks. I walked the pen line right then because standing still with adrenaline in your blood is how you freeze twice. Near the bottom of the fence I found a woven wire section bowed out from wind strain, not open yet but close enough to count as a lesson. I braced the stock stick through the mesh, hauled the wire tight by hand, and hammered staples in with the butt of my flashlight until my fingers went numb inside wet gloves. Junie kept watch at my shoulder, checking tree line, then sheep, then me, like we were all one chore. I dragged 2 fallen limbs over the thinned brush gap for a temporary brace, and told myself I'd reset posts proper at first light. When I finally made one more pass with the beam, I found 3 smooth creek stones laid just inside the gate path, crossed over one another in a clean X, with the third set pointing toward that same weak stretch. Not decoration, direction. Inside, I toweled Junie dry, peeled off soaked coveralls, and set water to boil. The house creaked under gusts the way old houses do when they're deciding whether to complain or endure. I took my phone from the counter and opened Caleb's contact. My thumb hovered over call long enough for the screen to dim. I woke it again, typed out a message. Need to talk. Nothing bad tonight. Just need to talk. And left it sitting there unsent. Then I saved it to drafts, set the phone face down by the ledger, and wrote the night down in plain lines before memory could sand off edges. Time, weather, coyote count, retreat direction, fence weakness, stone marker, no stock loss. When I closed the book, Junie was already asleep with her muzzle on my boot. I rubbed the grey between her ears, listened to the wind ease toward morning, and kept the promise in front of me where I could not pretend I'd misplaced it. I left the ledger open on the table and sat with my elbows on my knees, listening to the last of the wind comb through the cottonwoods. Sleet ticked now and then against the window, softer than before, and the house had that post-storm tiredness to it, like old boards exhaling. Junie slept hard against my boot, warm and heavy, and every so often her paws twitched in a dream. I watched the dark rectangle of my phone and told myself I would send the message to Caleb before first light. No bargaining, no rearranging, no excuse built out of chores. I'd just reached for it when the baby monitor by the sink cracked to life with a sharp rustle from the carving shed. Then a low, strained bawl I knew before my mind caught up. "Daisy," I said, already standing. Junie was up with me in one motion. I shoved my arms into my coat, jammed my feet into wet boots, and snatched the lantern instead of the flashlight, because wind was still gusting. The yard was slick and shining under the pole light. Water was running where it shouldn't, a narrow, fast sheet coming down from the north line and cutting across the track toward the creek. I half slid, half ran to the shed with Junie tight on my left knee. Daisy was down on her side, flanks heaving, eyes wide and rolling white, the calf half delivered and still. I got to her head first, hand on her neck, talking steady like Ellen used to talk to skittish mares. "You're all right, girl. Easy now. Easy." She pushed. I pulled when the contraction hit. Wet straw, steam, cold air, my breath burning in my throat. The calf came free in a rush and hit the bedding with a soft thud, small and dark, and shivering at once. I cleared its nose with my sleeve, rubbed hard along its ribs, and felt relief crack through me when it coughed and jerked. Daisy turned and started licking with that fierce, practical tenderness cows have. I laughed once, breathless and shaky. "Good girl. That's my girl." Then a fresh gust hammered the shed door open against the wall, and the new runoff stream punched under the threshold, cutting straw away in a skinny current. The calf tried to gather its legs too soon, tipped wrong, and slid. I lunged, caught one hind leg for a second, lost grip on the slick hide, and watched that little body skid through the gap where the lower board had split last month. It disappeared into the dark toward the bank. No. No. I was out the door before the word finished, lanterns swinging wild. The ground by the creek had turned to black mud, the bank slumped and treacherous from the washout. I saw the calf below, tangled in reed stems, trying to bleat and only making thin, broken sounds. Daisy bellowed from behind me, a deep, panicked call that seemed to shake my spine. I started down, and my boot went out from under me. I hit one knee, caught a root with both hands, and for one cold second understood exactly how bad one wrong move would be there in the dark. Then another shape moved on the bank to my right, so quiet I only saw him when the lantern light caught wet fur and the broad arc of a shoulder. He came down the slope sideways, testing each foothold before committing weight. One long arm braced against a cedar trunk so the mud wouldn't take him. The bank should have collapsed under that size. It held. He reached the calf, paused, and waited while it kicked once more. Then he slid both hands beneath it, one supporting chest, one cradling hindquarters, and lifted like he was picking up something made of glass. The calf's shaking eased against him. He turned uphill, leaned into the grade, and climbed with deliberate, unhurried strength until he reached the flat by the old hay wagon. I had gotten my feet under me by then, and stumbled after him, still half expecting the whole scene to break apart into sense. It didn't. He set the calf beneath the wagon's lee side where wind couldn't knife straight through, then stripped 3 deadfall limbs from the hedge with quick practiced motions and angled them in a rough fan to block the draft. Not piled, not random, built. I stood 10 feet away in freezing mud with my lantern shaking in my hand and watched him tuck the last branch in place with fingertips that could have snapped fence posts like kindling. I told myself this couldn't be real, I heard myself say. Not to him exactly, maybe to Ellen, maybe to the part of me that had gone hard to survive. I told myself there was always an explanation if I looked long enough. I am a man who can list vaccine dates from memory, who knows what 6 kinds of track look like in wet clay, who trusts weight and weather and numbers because numbers don't leave. I wanted the world to stay that small because small worlds can be managed. But I knew, somehow, that I wasn't in danger, and right then that mattered more than being right. Daisy had pushed out of the shed and was bawling from the edge of the yard, torn between fear and pull toward her calf. Junie stood between us all, alert but calm, glancing from Daisy to the wagon, as if assigning positions. The calf gave a stronger cry this time, and the sound carried downfield. That was when eyes appeared along the far fence. 3 sets, low and pale in the lantern spill. Split Ear stood forward of the other 2, chest out, head high, reins slicking the scarred notch in his ear. He took 2 silent steps down the fence line and stopped when the big one straightened to full height between him and the wagon. No rush, no roar, just a broad, still presence planted in the mud, shoulders squared, arms loose at his sides, as steady as a gatepost set in concrete. The coyotes held there a long moment. Wind hissed through dead grass. Daisy's breathing rasped. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my jaw. Split Ear lowered his head first. Not submission like a dog, decision. He turned uphill, looked back once, then trotted toward the ridge with his 2 followers in line behind him. Their eyes vanished into brush and did not return. The field went quiet except for the creak and the small, hungry sounds of a newborn trying to live. The big one looked toward me then, and I saw those amber-brown eyes clear in the lantern glow, rain beading along his brow and muzzle. I took 1 step closer without meaning to. My knees gave out before I reached him. I dropped beside Daisy near the wagon wheel, 1 hand on her neck, the other on the calf's slick shoulder, and grief hit me full in the chest, with no warning and no mercy. I bent over and cried hard enough my shoulders shook, ugly and loud and years too late. "Ellen," I said into wet hide and wool coat and mud. "Ellen, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I said her name again, then again, each time easier and harder both. Daisy nosed my shoulder. The calf pushed weakly against my palm and found its legs for a second, then sank back. Junie leaned against my side like a brace. When I could breathe without choking, I looked up. He was still there, 3 paces back, giving space. Watching, not intruding, just present. "Thank you," I said, voice wrecked. "For all of it. For the posts, for the nights, for this." He held my gaze for one slow breath, then tipped his head once and stepped backward into the weather dark, each footfall careful around straw and wire and the edge of Daisy's reach. By the time I stood, he was already at the tree line, shape merging with cedar shadow, then gone. I got mother and calf into the shed with a gate panel and a lot of muttering. Dried the calf with old towels, checked breathing, gums, temp with fingers that still shook. Daisy settled once she could lick in peace. I hung a heat lamp lower and piled fresh straw high against the draft gap, then sat on an overturned bucket watching them until the calf finally latched and drank. The sky outside had started to pale from black to iron grey. I washed my hands in the sink so cold water hurt, then picked up my phone and called Caleb. He answered on the third ring, voice thick with sleep and concern in the same breath. "Dad, you okay?" "No," I said, then swallowed. Yes, farm's okay, I'm okay. Daisy calved early in the storm. Rough start, but they're both alive. A pause then. "You calling at 5:30 to give me livestock updates?" I gripped the counter edge and made myself stay in the moment. "I'm calling because I've been wrong. For a long time. I hid behind work and acted like silence was strength. It wasn't. It was me being scared and proud at the same time, and you paid for it." The line went quiet enough I could hear him breathe. He said softly, "Dad, I should have answered your calls. I should have asked for help. I miss your mom and I didn't know where to put it, so I put it on everyone else. On you, most of all." My voice cracked and I let it. "I'm sorry, Caleb. I don't need you to fix me. I just need to stop pretending I don't need my son." When he spoke again, his voice had that rough edge mine had. "I didn't know how to come in without making it worse. Every time I tried, you were already halfway out the door." "I know." Another pause. Then, "Do you want me to come over today?" I looked through the window toward the north pasture where dawn mist was laying low over repaired fence and wet grass. "Yeah," I said, "if you can. We've got a washout by the creek and a split board on the carving shed. Could use another set of hands." A small breath, almost a laugh. "So that's your peace offering. Lumber. Best language I got." "It'll do," he said. "I'll be there by 9. Save me coffee that won't strip paint." "No promises." After we hung up, I stood a while with the phone in my hand, listening to the house wake. Junie thumped her tail once against the floorboards and went back to sleep. Outside, the first morning birds started up in the cottonwoods, and the ridge stayed coyote quiet. By the time Caleb's truck rolled up the lane, the sky had cleared to a hard, bright blue that only shows after a freeze. I was in the shed checking Daisy when I heard his door close. Junie reached the yard first, stiff in her hips but moving fast, and gave one sharp bark that turned into a whine when she recognized him. He crouched to hug her, forehead pressed to her neck for a second before he straightened. He looked older than when I'd last seen him up close, leaner through the face, beard coming in patchy like mine did at his age. He wore his mother's old canvas jacket with a mended cuff. We stood 3 feet apart, both of us with hands in jacket pockets, both suddenly awkward in our own skin. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, kid." He nodded toward the shed. "You weren't exaggerating. She did cough. Come see." Inside, Daisy watched us with one suspicious eye and kept chewing. The calf, still damp at the ears, wobbled up and down on uncertain legs, determined as anything. Caleb leaned on the gate and smiled in a way I hadn't seen since before the funeral. "She's little," he said. "He," I replied. "Checked twice. Good lungs on him." "Yeah." We stood there in warm, hay-scented air, listening to the calf suck and Daisy grunt softly, and all the speeches I'd rehearsed collapsed into something simpler. "I'm glad you're here," I said. He kept his eyes on the calf and nodded. "Me too." We worked through the morning with the easy rhythm of people who had built things together before words got complicated. He held the new board while I drilled. I tamped gravel while he set stone in the washout trench. We reset a brace post by the creek and stretched wire along the lower run where runoff had bowed it. Around noon, Marty drove by to drop mineral and leaned out his window. "Well, look at this," he called. "Fishers in one frame. Mark the calendar." Caleb grinned. He finally admitted one person can't wrestle a whole farm. Marty pointed at me. "I've been saying that since you were 12. His gaze drifted to the ridge and back. "Haven't heard Coyotes in days. You?" "No," I said. He gave me a long look, like he wanted to ask more and decided not to. "Maybe something bigger claimed a shift," he said lightly, then tapped the steering wheel. "Yell if you need wire. I got extra." That evening, after Caleb left with a cooler of eggs and 2 jars of canned beans I forced on him, I walked to the back pasture with Junie. The light was honey gold across the grass, and the creek carried that clean winter smell of stone and leaf and cold water. At the pine edge, I found deep tracks in the soft bank mud from the storm night, clear enough now to hold shape. Beside one print sat 3 smooth creek stones on a flat stump, arranged in the same crossed pattern as before, with a 4th stone set a little apart, pointing toward the house. I knelt. The stones were dry on their undersides, set there after morning dew. "Understood," I said quietly. I didn't see him that night. I didn't see him again. The days that followed were ordinary in the best way. Frost, feed, thaw, mud, repeat. Daisy's calf strengthened and turned bold, kicking at shadows and trying to buck with his tail straight up. The hens settled back into loud routine complaints. The goats quit bunching at dusk and spread themselves loose in the shed again. Each dawn I checked the north line out of habit and found coyote tracks at a distance, never crossing the same invisible boundary where they used to test me. Split Ear showed once on the ridge at sunset, a dark cutout against snow cloud, then turned without coming down. Caleb came the next Saturday and the one after that. Not formal visits, work visits. He'd roll in with a thermos and a list written on scrap cardboard. Tighten gate hinges, clear brush at creek ford, insulate the mudroom pipe. We talked while we worked, then, while we ate sandwiches on the tailgate, and the talks stayed practical until they didn't. One cold afternoon at the north fence, he was stapling mesh while I held tension. He said, without looking at me, "I was mad at you. Still am sometimes. But mostly, I was scared you were disappearing on purpose." I kept the wire tight and stared at the cedar post. I was. Didn't know how to stop. He drove one more staple and finally met my eyes. "Then don't stop now." "I won't." He nodded once. "Good." By late winter, we rebuilt the whole north run where spring wash had eaten it year after year. New posts, better drainage, stone packed at the low corner. We set each cedar in line and tamped around it, while Junie supervised from a patch of sun, greying muzzle on her paws, occasionally lifting her head toward the pines, as if checking attendance. Sometimes she'd give that soft chuff and wag once, and I'd glance up too. Most times there was only wind moving through needles and the long, patient quiet of trees. It was enough. On the first warm day of March, Ellen's funeral anniversary came around, and I woke with that familiar pressure in my chest, but not the old dread. I cut 3 wild asters from a sheltered bank by the creek where they'd come early, stubborn things, and set them at the water trough in a neat fan against the rusted metal. Then I sat on the porch step with coffee and called Caleb before chores. He answered on the first ring. "You beat my alarm," he said. Figured I'd start a tradition, I told him, calling before I talked myself out of it. He was quiet a second. I like that tradition. Me too. That afternoon, he came by anyway. We walked out to the back pasture together, boots sinking in thaw soft ground, Junie weaving between us. At the pine edge, he stopped and looked at the trees, then at me. Marty says you've been sleeping better, he said. Marty talks too much. He does. He also said this place feels calmer. I let out a breath and watched it disappear in thin sun. It does. He squinted toward the ridge. You ever figure out what changed? I could have lied. Could have said weather pattern, prey cycle, luck. All partly true and not true enough. I kept my eyes on the pines where evening light was beginning to gather. Something kept watch when I couldn't, I said. That's the best words I've got. Caleb studied my face, searching for a joke or a warning sign, then just nodded. All right, he said. I can live with best words. We turned back as the light lowered. Halfway to the barn, Junie paused, looked over her shoulder at the tree line, and gave one last easy wag before trotting after us. Spring came for real a few weeks later, green pushing through old thatch, creek running high but clear, calves bawling at dawn with healthy impatience. Coyotes still called sometimes from far ridges, thin and distant, where wild things belong. They did not test my fence. They did not circle my pens at midnight. The farm stayed coyote quiet in the close dark hours, held by a boundary I couldn't map, and no longer needed to explain. I kept one of the smooth creek stones on the mudroom shelf beside Ellen's folded grocery list, not as proof for anyone else. As a reminder to myself that the world is wider than the ledger pages I trust, and kinder than the version I carried after loss hollowed me out. On hard mornings, when the ache returns or shame tries to dress up as self-reliance again, I put my hand on that stone before I pull on my boots. Then I step outside and do the work in front of me, not alone anymore, not in the ways that matter. Last evening, Caleb and I finished hanging the new gate on the north line. We checked swing, set the latch, and stood shoulder to shoulder looking over pasture going gold in the sinking sun. Junie sat between us, ears up, eyes on the pines, calm as ever. Looks solid, Caleb said. Yeah, I answered. It does. We stood there until the light thinned and the first stars came up over the ridge, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no need to outrun dusk, because something vast and gentle had once guarded what I loved until I could stand here and guard it with him.